So it is now my pleasure to introduce our special guest, Doug Soldat, professor and extension soil specialist and department chair for the Department of Soil and Environmental Sciences at UW-Madison. And we also have Mark Renz joining us, professor and extension weed specialist from the Department of Plant and Agroecosystem Sciences. So let's get into some questions. Lisa, what do you have for us so far?
Well, I'd like to start with Debbie's question about snow on the mountain, which is, of course, the variegated form of goutweed. Um, Debbie is wanting to know how to get rid of that, and I know that you did suggest some possibilities, Mark, for that. Maybe you could talk to us about what we can do at this time of year yet for treating that snow on the mountain / goutweed.
Yeah, so this is a really problematic plant, and it produces a lot of its stored energy below ground, which really makes it resistant to a lot of different management techniques. Unfortunately, the management techniques are very specific to the environment it's growing. If it's growing in a flower bed and there's nothing else there but just goutweed, which is usually what it is, probably this time of year, a systemic herbicide would work the best. This plant hasn't really been widely researched. But talking to practitioners, we think products that contain triclopyr or glyphosate broadcasted right now is a great time because a lot of the energy is going below ground into the roots and rhizomes. And my expectation is you'll get suppression, but not elimination, and probably then can follow it up with some other management techniques. I think the challenge is when other good stuff is growing in there with it, it really limits our options to really mulching and hand removal, which will be really intensive for many years. So those are just some initial thoughts. If there are some more specific scenarios, I can talk about it. I know in extreme cases, I've taken creeping bellflower in this and just excavated the soil like a foot deep and sifted through the soil and removed those perennial fragments. And that works really well, but that's a heck of a lot of work. So maybe do that before this weekend when we have some really nice weather before the cold comes in, and you can burn some calories and do some weed control.
Yes, as a follow-up to that question, there was one that talked about exactly that, removing goutweed out of Monarda, branch coneflower in established beds. Obviously, you can't spray. Is painting herbicide on an option in those areas?
Yeah, there are several options where you can really direct that spray so that it doesn't hit any of the other tissues. And with these systemic herbicides are foliarly absorbed, if we can just get it onto the leaves of the plant in question and not the others, we can get some selective control. Options to do that would be painting it on. You might have heard of this thing called the glove of death, where you take a latex glove and then put a cotton glove over that, and then you can put the herbicide on the cotton glove and just touch the stuff you want to treat. That's kind of a dangerous approach, but it can be effective. You could also put newspaper and cover up the desirable plants so that they don't get contacted with the spray. So those all work well, but we need to worry about the herbicide we use. If we're going to use a herbicide that persists in the soil and will have activity, like triclopyr does persist for a short period, that still will have the potential. It'll go into the target plant, kill the plant, and as that plant dies, it's going to re-release that triclopyr into the soil where it can be then taken up by other plants. So that's where we want to rely on something that doesn't persist and isn't active in the soil, like glyphosate. That's one of the benefits of that, because once it's released in the soil, it's immediately bound to the soil surface. So not available to plants. I can take it to Doug's lab, and Doug can do fancy stuff to that to get that glyphosate to detach. But we rarely get that happening in the environment and make it available to the plants. So that's one of the benefits, but you need to be careful on what herbicide you use, that you're not using one that can persist and be active in the soil. I know that's a long answer, but it's really important to be aware of that.
Okay. So I know that Doug talked about using Fiesta, which is iron-based, in his video that Julie's given you the link for. I often get questions from people about Creeping Charlie and organic methods. So Doug, if you could talk about the Fiesta product and also answer Brenda's question about cardboard and thick mulch to prevent Creeping Charlie.
Sure, Lisa. So Fiesta is a trade name of an herbicide that you can find under different names. Fiesta was kind of the first one to commercialize it, but it's iron HEDTA, which is
Doug,
oh.
You're coming in a little muffled. Can you get a little closer to your mic?
Ooh, sorry about that. Is that any
Oh, that's
better?
better.
Okay. So iron-based herbicides are interesting. They kill plants because some plants aren't tolerant of high amounts of iron and others are. And it turns out that a lot of grasses are tolerant of high rates of iron. So Fiesta is an herbicide. It's, I hesitate to, it's not organic. It's not like labeled under the USDA organic method, but it definitely fits the alternative herbicide, alternative to like a conventional product description. So drawback of the product like this is it's not systemic necessarily, like it doesn't get translocated to the roots and kill all parts of the plant. So you do get regrowth from something like Creeping Charlie or ground ivy, and it's expensive. But if you're looking for an alternative to a conventional method, that's the one that works the best on a lot of lawn weeds. So the application strategies that work best are apply these iron-based herbicides at the label rates about 2 weeks apart in the fall. And you can also do that same 2 week apart application in the spring if the weeds persist or come back. With something like ground ivy, we often find like eradication is almost impossible because it's related to the ecology of it. Like it's growing in shade, lawn doesn't like shade. So, that's a good reason to use a product like Fiesta or an iron-based herbicide because you're going to be constantly doing it over and over and over. And you're really just applying iron, which is a nutrient that you're using as an herbicide because you're applying it at higher rates. The second part of the question was about using cardboard to smother ground ivy. Is that right?
Correct.
Yeah. So sure. I mean, you can smother any plant like that, and if you block out the light, eventually it'll run out of resources. Chances are, though, it'll grow back when you remove the cardboard because that's what it does. But that's another kind of alternative to an herbicide that you can use is you can use plastic or cardboard or something to kill it, and then populations will likely rebound. I don't know, Mark, if you have any other thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, there's been quite a bit of work on the knotweed species, Japanese knotweed, Bohemian knotweeds, and smothering, tarping. And there's been lots of studies on these plants, and it's based on how much stored energy is below ground, but it takes years to get eradication. You can get eradication, but it takes years where nothing is growing. So I think it works really well in a system where you have a bed and you have a few plants that you want that are already there that you can put the cardboard next to and are already established. And then it'll just take a little bit of weeding because Creeping Charlie will find those holes and it will poke through or the seams. But it's really effective. But if you have a flower bed that's mostly flowers, it's not really a realistic approach. You basically have to take it out of production for years, or at least a year, if you included something like soil solarization. So it's a good approach, but it has drawbacks like everything else does.
Okay. We have a question. I often get questions about using non-labeled home kitchen cabinet products on various weeds. And we know that for perennial weeds that are really tough, like all of the ones that we're talking about today, creeping bellflower, creeping Charlie, goutweed, and Canada thistle. Does vinegar, horticultural vinegar, work on those?
Yeah, so how vinegar works, it's the acetic acid, and basically what happens is it breaks up the plasma membrane in those plant cells. And so it creates a wound, and the cytoplasm of the living cells, the juice of the cells leaks out. That's the mechanism of how it works. We would call this a contact herbicide because where it lands and where it causes this impact. So you could apply this at the right dose onto Canada thistle or any of these, and you'll see damage. And if you get it to contribute at a high and even enough coverage, you might get all of the above ground biomass to senesce. But none of that injury is going into the below ground perennial tissues, and you'll get rapid resprouting. So I can talk a little bit later. I think, Doug, you may have some experience in turf settings with this. It tends to be more non-selective versus selective. And there are some caveats on how you may enhance control, and I can talk about that after Doug's comments.
Yeah, I would just say for lawns, you know, when people are looking for organic alternative options, vinegar was kind of the only thing that we would recommend. There's some soaps and other contacts that do basically the same thing, but they kill the grass too. So then you'd have these brown spots everywhere where you applied it, and dead grass as well. Grass would grow back, but chances are weed would grow back too, like Mark said. So that's why in the turf world, we've moved towards these iron-based products, because I think they fulfill the same kind of desire. That kills the plant also sort of temporarily or incompletely, but doesn't hurt the grass. So we don't use iron, or we don't recommend the vinegar-based herbicides very much anymore. Like maybe sidewalk cracks and things like that would be good, because the iron product will actually stain. It'll turn it orange. So that would be an example of where we would recommend vinegar in a lawn situation.
Yeah, and I think Doug's point about these sidewalk cracks and other areas is really a good fit for vinegar, because it also will, obviously cause injury to annual plants as well. And usually we don't have any desirables in that situation. Now, I do want to say there has been some research that if you can get enough acetic acid in the soil, and we're talking like applying at a rate of hundreds of gallons per acre, you can actually kill some of the perennial tissues. They've done this with some aquatic plants in some scenarios, but it's causing damage to everything else that's in the soil as well too. So I want to, caution you, it's probably not a good idea to take a bunch of vinegar and put it in your flower bed, but in these sidewalk cracks, I think there's very minimal off-target risk to doing that, and you may be able to kill some of those perennial tissues in those isolated settings. The biggest concern is really concern for eye injury, particularly if you're using the higher concentration acetic acid. So be careful when applying it, because you can damage your eyes pretty easily.
Mark, would that also run the risk of damaging the sidewalk with the acetic acid?
I'm not an engineer, but I'm going to say no.
Okay.
A follow-up question to these home remedies. You were both talking a lot about vinegar, but I know a lot of people are mixing up, I think, vinegar and soap and salt together for weed control or to attack weeds. Does this kind of same conversation apply to those types of mixtures?
Yeah, so the soap acts the same way as the vinegar does, is it's breaking up the plasma membrane. I don't know, Doug, if you know what adding the salt does, if that's also the mechanism to invoke it. So it has some benefit, but it's non-selective. And so I think that's a really limiting factor on this too. And it just really hasn't, I mean, we haven't done any research on this. Doug, have you done any research on different concentrations and mixtures? It's kind of, there's not a lot of data on it.
Yeah, we've used a product that's literally sodium chloride, and it's called Adios, and it's labeled as an herbicide. So when we do it, we're usually testing out these commercially available products. We haven't experimented with kind of our own mixtures of these things in most of our trials. But again, they all sort of do the same thing. They're destroying membranes. Salt will pull water out of the plant. The soaps destroy the membranes. The vinegar does that too. So they kind of all work in about the same way, and they have the same kind of universal effects as they kill desirable plants and the weeds that you're targeting too, which is a disadvantage of them.
And I believe salt also has bad effects on the soil structure. Is that correct?
Yeah, it can. I mean, typically in Wisconsin, we get enough rainfall where the relatively small amount of salt that you put down, if you over apply road salt or on your sidewalks, you can kill the grass. Most people have probably seen something like that before. And just to comment on that, that means you're putting down too much salt on your sidewalk. So you should be using salt at a concentration. Again, just like we say for everything, read the label, and you actually need less salt to melt that ice than you think you do. And and yeah, so if you use salt appropriately, it's generally not a problem for the soil stuff. So, but if you're putting down really high rates, again, a reason that I really don't like the home remedy thing is because there are no labels to read, and you're mixing up things and you're reading things off the internet, and it's better to stick with products that are intended for their use.
And we as government representatives, I don't think we're even allowed to recommend anything that has not been labeled for that particular purpose.
Yeah, I mean, that's what makes it a tricky issue is, in theory, if you are taking Dawn dish soap and you're mixing it up and applying it as a pesticide, the Department of Agriculture could write you a citation because that's not labeled for that use. Now, would they do that? No, but it becomes a complex issue when we start talking about this, and this is one of the reasons why we don't recommend it, and we don't really actively research it too, is another reason, as Doug said.
Great comments. Lisa, I'm going to jump in because I saw a few questions about wild violets, our state flower. So I think this brings up also another point of, what's considered a weed in your lawn or garden and what might not be. I would personally argue that I'm going to keep the violets in my yard, but I see some questions about controlling them in lawn situations and also in flower beds.
Go for it, Doug.
Okay. Yeah, so they're native to Wisconsin, like Julie said, and we my personal preference aligns with Julie's. Like, great, they're adapted to that area, and enjoy them. But if you want to find the research says the best conventional herbicide to control wild violets is one that contains triclopyr. So that's a product that has success on that fairly difficult to control weed, which thrives in kind of shady, moist environments where lawns don't like to thrive in shady, moist environments. So that's partly why it comes in. So in that case, fine fescue, specifically chewing's fine fescue, is the best adapted grass to help compete with the violets. So if you have Kentucky bluegrass, you're more likely to get invaded by ground ivy, creeping Charlie, wild violets. If you have a grass that's more aggressive in shady environments, like a chewing's fescue, you might maintain the density, which will keep the weeds from creeping in. But triclopyr is kind of the best control option. You can also try the Fiesta for an alternative. You will get regrowth, and it'll be a constant battle. But those are my two recommendations.
I can sympathize with that person because I've been overrun with violets myself. And as much as, I like them for being a native plant, we have aggressive native plants as well as
That's true.
non-natives.
I'm going to ask another question here because I have this in my yard and it is my personal nemesis, bindweed. Why is it so hard to get rid of? Ideas to get rid of it. What should we do?
Yeah, well, that's a challenge. I'm sure it's in your flower. Is it in your flower beds or is it in your perennial beds with your woody?
It's everywhere, Mark. It's everywhere.
So it's this plant is really difficult to control, and its biology makes it so. So when you see that, in the middle of summer, you see all that above ground vines and biomass, that's less than 10% of the plant's overall biomass. So 90+% of all the energy and resources go to growing these perennial roots. And the perennial roots go down and they go lateral. So keep that in mind when you're managing this. So it sounds like, Julie, you've had this for years in there. So there's this huge amount of biomass that's there that makes it difficult to control. And then if it's in like underneath shrubs or stuff like that, it's almost impossible to gain access to pull it out or to spray it or do whatever too. So really, I think with any of these creeping perennials, I think the management needs to be long-term and it needs to be multi-tactic. And so in flower beds, I always think your number one resource is to come up with some type of mulch. You could use fabric mulch if you can get that in place. And if you can affix that tight and not have gaps, it can be good at suppressing that. You just need to cut out the holes for your desirable plants. Cardboard could do the trick. You could even use some type of organic mulch. But the bindweed will grow through that, and then you'll need to come back and either hand pull it or treat it with a systemic herbicide. But it's, when you have an area that it's been in a long time, it's really a challenge to control. And I see it really getting out of control in areas where you just don't have access to hand pull that after mulch is putting in too. And then I like to say this a lot, a little bit of love goes a long way in managing weeds in gardens, and just getting after it, every 2 to 3 weeks, and being persistent, you can really make a dent. But I think mulch is the easiest thing to add, and then see what other type of management approaches. And I think, kind of related to Doug's comment, our best weed management resource is a competitive group of plants. So if we can do something to make the plants there more competitive and shade it out, that's just going to benefit us. Grass, Doug alluded to grass species and selectivity and just managing your grass correctly. If you can do one thing right, it'd be, manage the grass correctly, and you're going to have less weeds. More important than spraying a herbicide or weeding or doing anything else. So keep that in the back of your minds as well. Those are just some initial comments, but it's, it's a challenge, and it's not one that's going to go away in, one weeding or 2 or even 3. It's going to be a multi-year approach.
Thank you, Mark. We're getting more and more questions about creeping Charlie and bellflower, so we'll refer to those videos and fact sheets that we've put in. I do have kind of a lawn question here, Doug. They applied Weed Be Gone on their lawn for creeping Charlie before watching the video about controlling it, and they believe it was a 2,4-D amine. Can they follow up with spraying triclopyr, or would the two, if there's a mixing concern causing issues for the lawn?
Yeah, I think there's definitely want to have a waiting period. And so I think in the video, we talk about how follow-up applications can be beneficial for bad cases. So within, I would say, 2 to 3 weeks after that initial application, you'll start to see if the plant is regrowing or will start to regrow. So I think that would be the earliest that I would recommend going up with a follow-up application. But 2,4-D is actually decent against ground ivy. Certain populations, like we talked about in the video, there can be resistant biotypes. So your results may vary. Some are extremely sensitive, some are not sensitive at all. So just kind of wait and watch. And if you start to see the plant looking pretty healthy, then I'd give triclopyr a shot. And I am not a weed scientist. So everything I say, Mark, feel free to unmute and jump right in and correct me, because I study grasses. And of course, weeds are one component of that, just like insects and everything. So, but definitely don't spend most of my time thinking about controlling weeds.
Yeah, no,
like
you got it right. I mean, the key is that the 90+% of all of these herbicides are going to be absorbed by the foliage. So if you've made an application already that's damaged the foliage, you're going to get limited uptake. So you want to get some new actively growing plant tissue. So the one issue I'll say with the weed begone, with these dry conditions, if it hasn't been watered in, Doug, they may have really had poor absorption of that 2,4-D. And so they may have gotten poor control as a result. So, I think the key is look for actively growing plants that have leaves that are growing. And then I know the follow-up question will always be like, how late can you apply? What I'd say is a rule of thumb, like now in general is a great time to apply. Those leaves will start to die back and as we get frost and freezes. Look at the plants. As long as you have green leaves, they will absorb that herbicide. And with some of these, like Canada thistle, we've sprayed it well into middle of November and got effective control. So you can get good control later on. The one trick is that you want conditions to be warm because that helps the absorption of that herbicide. So what we tell people is when you make an application, if you can get the air temps to 50 degrees Fahrenheit the day of or within a day or two of application, that will be ideal. So that's another trick that you can go by when making the application.
Hey, Mark, we did get a question about clopyralid, which I had great hopes for, but now not so much, for controlling creeping bellflower. Could you address that? And I also want to direct people to the videos. If you didn't see the videos before you came to this program, we had Mark and Doug cover a lot of the questions that you're asking. So please check those out. The links are in the chat.
Yeah, so this is one of these convolutedly complex answers, but herbicides are registered for different uses. So some herbicides are registered for grass, some for turf, some are registered for corn and soybean and rice, and some are non-crop areas. But it gets even more nuanced than there. So we have some herbicides like the active ingredient clopyralid. One of the trade names is called Launtrol. It's registered in turf, but it's only registered in professional or non-residential turf. And so it gets really complicated and it gets really confusing to homeowners who just want to get something that works well. So I want to talk about why that's the case. Well, there's a lot of potential risk or harm that can be afforded by a lot of these herbicides, particularly ones that persist in the soil, like clopyralid. So this herbicide can persist in the soil for months to up to a year. And what's even worse about this is it also persists in the living plant tissue that's sprayed. And so it was at one point one of the more common herbicides used in residential areas. But what happened is they found that people were taking their lawn clippings, and if you pull up your lawn clippings, where do most people put them in a compost bin? So that clopyralid that's attached to those leaf clippings goes into the compost bin, and the composting process does not break down the clopyralid. So what do we do with our soil after we've composted? We put it back in our gardens, right? Well, if you're putting contaminated compost with clopyralid in your garden, you're going to kill tomato plants, potato plants, and a whole lot of other things. And that's exactly what happened across the nation. So because of this, these companies decided we're not going to allow this product to be sold for residential turf scenarios because that's where the risk is high. Now, in golf courses and other places, they don't. They have much more control of what they do with the clippings, and they're aware of this issue, so they don't get it into the compost stream. So they have allowed that use in that scenario, but not those scenarios. So that's a very long-winded answer to saying that some of these products have some really bad unintended consequences. And in residential areas, they can be very sensitive to that. And that's why they're either not registered or we don't recommend them. So you can use Launtrol as a spot treatment in certain flower beds, but I never recommend it because there's a whole lot of restrictions involved, and the potential for risk to beautiful plants like you see behind Lisa is incredibly high. And so I don't think it's worth the benefit of the weed control. But in some instances it is. You can watch the video and learn more about that.
Thanks for that, Mark. I'm going to switch gears back to lawns a little bit because I'm seeing some lawn weed questions. And I know, Doug, you're not the weed specialist, but we have Mark here. So a couple of specific lawn weeds. Looks like people are dealing with spurge and quackgrass. I'm seeing off the top of my list here. Controlling lawn weeds, what do we do? Maybe addressing those two specifically.
Yeah, so I don't see a ton of spurge in, I'm going to go back to what Mark said, is like a well-managed lawn, healthy managed lawn, spurge isn't that common. So where you typically see spurge is be like kind of compacted soils or edges of like landscaping beds. It can kind of come up and spread. It's a summer annual, so you could prevent it with a pre-emergent herbicide. You can do that. Same way you'd prevent crabgrass from coming in. And again, the rule with crabgrass is same thing. Like usually I see crabgrass in poor soils that are thin. There's not a lot of soil there, so the grass thins out, crabgrass germinates. It does well in the heat, along sidewalk edges. So kind of fixing the environment. And then if you have a dense turf and a healthy soil, almost never see crabgrass. And you have to keep the part of the way in a healthy soil, good full sun environment. One of the failure points is nitrogen fertility. If you're not putting down 2-3 applications of nitrogen per year, you start to get thinning and gaps where the weeds can come in. So one of the things we teach in introductory turf grass management here at the university is the best herbicide is nitrogen, properly applied nitrogen. So about 2 pounds per 1,000 square feet per year, which again is about 2 to 3 applications of fertilizer that you buy off the shelf. Quackgrass. Also, same principles there. Quackgrass is generally an issue in lower maintenance or more poorly maintained turf. Unfortunately, it's very, very difficult to get out. Has these deep rhizomes, stores a lot of energy, up to 18 inches below ground, and will come back. There are some selective, or maybe one selective herbicide, tenacity it's called, or mesotrione is the active ingredient. And you can use that according to the label to control quackgrass, but it's not a single application. It's usually multiple applications over multiple years to get the populations back. But one of the things that we management wise is just mowing your lawn properly. So 2.5 inches every week or something like that, and then keeping your fertility up, the grass will start to outcompete the quackgrass, and you'll see the populations drop off there. But heavily infested areas, the standard recommendation is a non-selective herbicide like Roundup. You can find alternatives to that as well. And then wait for it to regrow, and then do it again, and then wait for it to regrow and do it again. Sometimes we even talk about removing layers of the soil to try to get all those pieces out. But again, it can go down so deep that might be impractical. So it's a very difficult weed. And that's my perspective. I'm sure Mark's got additional thoughts as well on those two.
Yeah, I mean, I think the key is what Doug hit on, is that when you have open or thin grass or turf, you have an opportunity for these annuals to establish. Prostate knotweed is another example, and they're just taking advantage of that open space. And so doing anything you can to minimize that by taking care of your grass, proper fertilization, timely mowing. And again, this fall fertilization is really important because that a lot of these, like prostrate knotweed, will germinate early in the spring. And if you I love this. You're talking about weeds, Doug. I'm talking about fertilization. So fall fertilization will cause earlier green up of your turf in spring, which will allow it to be more competitive against those weeds. So really, that's your strategy. And it happens in my lawn too, where I have thin areas. I had a bunch of spurge this year. With a lot of the rains, it really did well and took advantage of it. So just maintaining your lawn is the key. Don't think there's a silver bullet like a product like Tenacity or those others. They can give you some benefit, but they're not going to solve your problems. It's really tough to control a grass. And I think the one exception I would say, Doug, is with crabgrass is now that they're they have these new crabgrass post-emergent herbicides that are mixing, I believe it's Plateau or Mazapic in at low doses with 2,4-D, and you spray it right when the crabgrass is germinating. It has a little bit of post-emergence activity. I did that in my yard and I've eradicated it. I do a broadcast treatment during germination. You'll get 1 or 2 escapes. You can just squirt those escapes like you would a broadleaf herbicide, and I don't have any crabgrass. And I've been fertilizing like Doug says too. So you can get crabgrass under control. You do not need to always do this pre-emergence. And the seed doesn't persist long in the soil. So if you can take care of it, it goes away. And now I don't need to do broadcasts. I can just do spot treatments.
Great tips. I put an article that we have about lawn maintenance, which goes over the mowing height, fertilization practices. I linked that into the chat as well, so people can check that out about maintaining their turf. Lisa, do you see some pressing questions that you want to shoot out?
Oh, you're muted, Lisa.
Yeah.
I am muted. All right. Thank you. I got a question this year about removing Equisetum, the horsetail, and I see that there's one in the chat. So I know that that's a difficult one. I went down the rabbit hole of doing a lot of research on that, and I'm not sure that I'm ahead any. So Mark, if you have any brilliance to add.
Yeah.
Great.
So first, just some fun facts about Equisetum. There's 2 different. There's Hymenale and Arvents. One looks like little Christmas trees, and the other one just is like a spike. I think it's Arvents that is just the spike, and Hymenale looks more like the Christmas tree. But what's cool about them is they're related to the ancient plants in the Carboniferous era. Most of our forests were large versions of those plants that persisted. So a lot of the coal that we use has come from their ancestors. So that's just a little fun fact for you. In these tall, 30-foot tall versions of this, now they only get 6 inches to a foot tall. Again, like other perennials, they have these perennial root systems, and they don't have a lot of leaf tissue, so it's adds some incredible challenges to control. There aren't very many herbicides that work well. Glyphosate does not work well on this plant. It suppresses it, but poorly, I would say. We do have some other products that work better, but they're non-selective, they persist in the soil, and they have potential to move off-site. So we rarely recommend them in a flower bed type scenario. The only place we recommend them would be like in like gravel areas or areas that wasn't near any desirable plants. And if you're interested, I can provide the names of those products later. But we don't recommend them because of their potential for harm to other plants. So it's really a challenge to manage them. I think, you know, if it's in a small area, I would get out the shovel and try and dig up as much of those roots, and then try and put down with some fabric and lots of mulch, and expect that I'm going to have to keep after it. There's really no technique that I've really found that works really well or is effective. I think if you have the potential, it's full sun, put in a lawn. Because the beauty of putting in a lawn is you may not get all the perennial tissue, but what do you do to a lawn every week? You're mowing it. So you're doing additional management that's incorporated in the maintenance of the lawn. So some of those things could be options. It doesn't do well in shade. The other option would be to get some really, really competitive, large plants that shade it out, like maybe some of our native C4 grasses or something like that would be something to consider. So those are just some random thoughts, but that one's really a challenge. It's a challenge in our agricultural systems as well, too. I don't know, Doug, if you have any insights in turf.
No, not really. Just to say, you know, I'm glad you brought up the mowing too, because that is, you know, that's along with nitrogen, the mowing is an excellent herbicide and proper mowing too.
There is a question about buckthorn, and I wondered what you think of the efficacy of buckthorn baggies, Mark.
Oh, great. We're doing a lot of work with buckthorn lately. So again, buckthorn is a woody shrub. There are male and female plants. The female plants now have berries on them that the birds are rapidly eating. and pooping out right after they eat them because it actually has a diuretic in there. So there's many ways to manage buckthorn. The one way that Lisa mentioned is this thing called buckthorn baggies, which is just a thick piece of plastic that you cut the stump, place it over the stump with a zip tie, and then enclose it over the top of that. And it works really well. Its efficacy is really high because what happens is the dormant buds are all in that crown. And if you can get that bag over the top of that and seal it, those buds remain dormant because they need light to start to emerge to create to grow. So if you can adhere it low enough to the ground and tie it off, it works great. The problem is you go to a location and we don't just have one buckthorn stem or two. We have 1 or 2,000 or 10 or 20,000. And so it just becomes unrealistic to tie all these baggies onto all these plants. And they need to be on there until that woody material degrades, which can be years. So it can be rather unsightly. So yes, effective. So a good technique, but is it the best technique for your situation? If you just had one and you want to leave it there for a couple of years, great. But if you've got a forest full of it, I'd probably recommend something else. We've actually had scenarios where people have put them on and then other people thought they were trash. And so they went by and picked them up thinking it was trash. And, therefore eliminated all that work.
Oh, that's very sad. So what products do you recommend then for buckthorn? And I know that you do have this. We've put a link in the chat to Mark's website, and there are a lot of the weeds that we're talking about today that he has fact sheets on.
Yeah, I mean, so this is a plant that it really depends on the situation on how you're going to manage it. If you have like a small shrub in your backyard, you can take a leverage tool and just pull it out of the ground. It has a very low taproot. And if you can pull that crown out with the taproot in the top couple inches, that plant's dead. Obviously, if you have thousands of those, that's not a good option. We have other techniques where we can apply herbicides, either foliarly to the plant, or we can, and those are usually dilute concentrations. There's a range of herbicides that are effective. And then we have ones where we apply a higher concentration either to the cut surface or to the actual lower 1 foot of the plant. And we can get really effective control. I don't know if you guys can find it, but we actually have some research demonstrations and virtual tours of these various techniques and control strategies. So there's those options that work well. We've also been researching goat grazing and using goats to manage that. Goats strip the bark and eat the leaves. And if you can keep them on for 3 to 4 years, they can kill those plants. But it's very expensive to rent goats. And so usually that's cost prohibitive in many situations as well. So there's lots of methods to control it. It really comes down to finding the right method for your situation on how you want to control it. We're working in a lot of these forests that are just covered with buckthorn. In those, we're usually recommending some type of forestry mowing to mow the buckthorn, let it resprout, and then manage it with herbicides and other techniques, usually revegetation to stop the seedlings from coming up as well.
I think there's a follow-up question with the buckthorn, but also could be applied to using herbicides by water. So somebody had mentioned that they have buckthorn by, a stream or a channel that the branches are overhanging. So again, following the label for herbicides, but we have to be really careful when we're using any sort of pesticides by water. You want to talk about that,
and
Mark?
this is where it gets super tricky, right? So you can read the pesticide label and it'll give you instructions, and the pesticide label sometimes will say you're allowed to get over 20 to 30% overspray into the water. But we've got to realize that if you're going to apply a pesticide in an aquatic environment, you need to be certified to apply aquatic pesticides. So if you're making an application like this, make sure you can make it in a manner where if you're not certified for aquatic use, that you can be sure you wouldn't get control. So in this situation, stems are leaning over the water, I think that would lend itself to be a cut surface application. So you can cut that plant down, you'll have the stump that's on a terrestrial environment, and then you can go on and very carefully put the herbicide on the cut surface of that stump, get effective control without getting any herbicide directly into the water. If it's really close to the water, a lot of times what I tell people is, if you're concerned about, perception, or you're so concerned that some might get in, there are products that are registered for aquatic use. And so if the perception and concern about using pesticides near aquatic environments, just use an aquatically registered pesticide. You can still use it in a terrestrial environment. And that can give some of the stakeholders and other people a little bit more relief when using a pesticide near water. Aquatic pesticides are known to break down rapidly in these aquatic environments and not persist. And the products mixed in with those are the same. So those are just some tidbits and advice. If you're not sure if it's an aquatic environment or not, unfortunately, you got to contact the DNR and they're going to need to give a ruling on whether it's aquatic or not. And that'll take a long time for them to process that. So it's a challenging issue, but it doesn't mean that those plants shouldn't be removed.
Can I just jump in with just a general comment too about something that Mark said about reading a label? Is like, as a consumer, we're so used to just throwing away the instructions. You buy a TV, you just take it out of the box and figure out, I can put this together. You're cooking some food, and sometimes you have to dig out the package from the trash because you realize you forgot to read how many minutes you need to cook this thing for. But with pesticides, and I tell this to all my students, and when I'm talking about, read the label from start to finish, because I get a lot of emails like, well, how much do I mix in? Well, I don't know, because they're so different, and those labels have very, very specific, important instructions. And they're a little bit long, they're not impossible to get through, and there's often some really good tips in there. So I strongly encourage you to read, take an extra 10-15 minutes and read those labels, because that's what they're there for.
And technically, the label is the law. So using a pesticide in concentration or for uses you're not supposed to is technically against the law. And you'll note that on a lot of labels, they might give one rate for certain weeds and another rate for others. So that's another good reason that if you just read as far as 1 point, you might not actually be getting the instructions that will be most helpful for you.
Yes, read the label. And it also tells you what it can be used on. So not everything can be used on every pest or every plant or every situation. So but the marketing on all those products are really good. So it's definitely important to dig in and read that label. And if you need help, certainly reach out and we can help you. We can also kind of leads me to my next question, is thinking about, are there any possible side effects? There was a question about our pets out in, on the turf or in an area that maybe we are worried about the ground ivy or the creeping Charlie. There's no way to keep the dogs off of that if you were to spray, but what are maybe some other ideas? Or another option is to tolerate it, right? I mean, that's still an option.
Yeah, and I can give some insight to what I do. And Doug, you can tell me I'm full of what after I do it. But usually when I go out with my herbicide application, I'll go out. I have kids that run around and use my lawns, and so I'll go out and make the application. And I'll either make it like 4 hours before a rainfall event, or I'll make the application, wait for 3 or 4 hours. Usually that's enough time for that herbicide to be absorbed into the plant. And then I'll turn on the sprinklers and I'll just water it in so that other animals and other people won't, when they go over there, they won't get hit directly with it because it'll be watered into the soil. And it's a way of limiting the exposure to animals, kids, or other people too. So that's a trick I use. It's not going to eliminate exposure, but it's another thing to help minimize it. Am I losing effectiveness? Maybe 5%, but to me that's worth it so my kids don't get exposed to the pesticide.
Sounds solid to me. Yep, I do. I do similar strategies like that. Like sometimes, and you don't, it's not a spraying an herbicide is not like a very common event for me. I do it maybe not even every other year, right? So sometimes I'll do it. Hey, I'm going on vacation, or we're going on family vacation. Timing's about right. Do the application, and then I'm gone. So sometimes that's how I do the timing on that. The other thing is that there are alternatives. There are unknown risks. If you follow the label, the US EPA has deemed that those risks are acceptable relative to the benefits that we get from them. And of course, that doesn't apply to everybody. So that's why we would recommend using iron HEDTA. If you don't have a tolerance for any of those conventionals, there are alternatives that you can pursue.
Thank you both for that.
There is a question here about crown vetch, which I know is on the DNR's list of nasties, the NR 40 invasive plants list. So would either of you care to comment on that?
Yeah, so crown vetch is one of those that we did to ourselves. We brought it in because we thought it would give us all these benefits, but it wouldn't stay in place. It's expanding off where places we planted it and taking over. Perennial with creeping rhizomes, dominates an area where we don't get any other plants that will grow in that area. There are some herbicides that work really well in natural areas, not registered for residential use. Particularly products that contain aminopyrrolid, very low rates applied before flowering or in the fall, just not when it's flowering. You can get like almost eradication for 2 years. So those are products that we've used and had success, but again, not registered for homeowner use because it does persist in the soil and can have some of these non-target effects. There's concern about it getting into compost, although less so than clopyrrolid. There are some other products that work well. It's a full sun type plant, so I'm guessing that if you had some pretty aggressive mulching or fabric mulches, you could control it. But typically we see it, someone's planted it and it's like taking over and going into other people's yards. And so just trying to get it under control, usually a herbicide's the first step, and then you can follow that up with some other management.
With that one, it's really important not to let it go to seed too. Is that correct?
Yeah, thanks for pointing that out. So it is a legume and it has hard seed. So it produces lots of seed and that seed persists for many years in the soil. So then you're battling those seedlings for years to come. Thank you, Lisa, for reminding me about that.
Yeah, when I give weed talks, I make people repeat this mantra: don't let the weed go to seed. Because it will, if you think it outnumbers you now, wait till it goes to seed, then you've really got a problem. There's a question here about lily of the valley. I've fought with that one myself. It's such a lovely garden plant, lovely fragrant flowers, but oh my God, it's a thug. So how do we battle that one?
I don't have a lot of experience with that species, to be honest, Lisa. So if you have some anecdotal evidence, please share it. I don't have anything off the top of my head that I'd have to do some research to come up with an answer for that one.
Okay. I don't unfortunately have anything that has worked for me, so I don't have a whole lot useful to add to that. But I do recommend doing a search on lily of the valley management, and then put site:/.edu. And for any searches that you do, if you do site:/.edu, that will bring up research-based information from all kinds of colleges, universities, and that's good, solid information when you're doing research on the internet and you're finding all kinds of things.
There was a question that just came in, and we've been talking a lot about herbicides. I do want to point out that in the fact sheets we've been linking up, they also list non-chemical options. So mowing, hand pulling, mulching and tarping, which Mark had mentioned. So there could be non-chemical options. You know, some of these tough weeds, you might usually a combination of methods is going to be kind of your tactic, right? Of hand pulling, but you might need to do some chemical control, or depending on the weed, the situation, the location. So I think there are some factors to consider, but there are some non-chemical methods listed in the fact sheets when we talk about specific weeds.
And I think on that note, I think I would just add a piece of advice. A lot of times we'll have like a flower bed or one of our lawns or a part of our lawns that's invaded. One of the things we don't think about is we focus on management, but just focus on keep that plant from getting into other parts of your yard. If you can isolate it, it just means you don't have to do that extra management. So what does that mean? If you're taking lawn clippings from your lawn that's infested, don't put it in your flower bed or somewhere else. Little things like that can really help keep that isolated problem isolated. It's a lot easier to deal with like one small part of your yard versus everywhere that has it too. So keep that thought of prevention in the back of your minds. And when you're bringing in something new, like new topsoil, you know, new compost, new something else, there's always the opportunity for that to be infested with weed seed. And so ask if it's infested or not. A lot of times people don't know, but remember when you bring in something new from off-site, your window to deal with that is right in the growing season, right after things start growing. So make sure to spend some time looking for new stuff. And if something looks out of place, get it before, Lisa, cue up your mantra, get it before it goes to seed when it's small so that you can prevent that new infestation from spreading.
There's a question about pokeweed as well.
That's a fun one because we have a native pokeweed and a non-native pokeweed. We're just in the final stages. We might have launched it of having a fact sheet that how to differentiate between the two. Most of the pokeweed we see is actually the native one, but in Dane County, we're blessed by, I think someone at the university brought in this non-native one and it's caused some problems. So it's a native weed, but it is a problem spread by seed, pretty difficult to control. To be honest, what I do is I see plants growing up, I take my garden loppers and I just chop them down and just really focus on preventing seed production. And that seems to keep it at bay. Sometimes the plants resprout, usually only for 1 or 2 years, and then they die. A herbicide would work well, but I just use mechanical removal and try and get it before it flowers and there's any berries. Because if you get those berries, I'm sure, Lisa, you know about that on your hands, it'll stain your hands and it's almost impossible to get that stain out with soap too. So try and be proactive on keeping that one at bay.
And that's another don't let it go to seed plant.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think we're going to wrap up there. We are running out of time, and I really appreciate Doug and Mark joining us today and providing your expert advice on just some of these weeds. I know there's other weeds that we didn't get to talk about.